The calm before the storm. September 1943. The Apennine Mountains of Italy stretched endlessly, their jagged peaks cloaked in mist and shadow, hiding secrets of war. The German army had fortified the mountain passes, knowing their strategic importance. Supply lines, troop movements, and communication networks all relied on these narrow trails. Holding them meant controlling the flow of battle. Far below, Italian troops and partisan fighters prepared for an audacious mission. Captain Alessandro Ricci, a veteran officer of the Italian army, led a mixed unit of 30 men, regular soldiers alongside local resistance fighters who knew every hidden path through the rugged terrain. The soldiers carried rifles, machine guns, and a few light mortars, but their greatest weapon was determination. They had orders to take Monte Forno, a ridge heavily defended by German forces, and to disrupt enemy supply routes. Success could shift the balance in the region. Failure could mean total annihilation. Ricci's men moved silently along narrow trails, boots crunching in frost-hardened mud. Each step was calculated, each shadow observed. Among the troops was Marco, a young partisan whose family had been executed in German reprisals. His anger and grief fueled his courage, and he moved like a ghost through the trees, rifle at the ready. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping branch heightened their tension. The Apennines were alive, and in the mountains silence could be deadly. The terrain was brutal. Narrow trails clung to steep cliffs, while jagged rocks threatened every misstep. Snow, though light for the season, coated the slopes and made footing treacherous. The men climbed carefully, aware that one wrong move could send them tumbling hundreds of feet into a frozen ravine. The cold bit through gloves and jackets, turning fingers numb, and each breath clouded the air with white mist. Morale depended not only on courage but on sheer endurance. German forces watched from their fortified outposts, their eyes trained on the trails leading up the ridge. Spotters signaled movements along the mountainside, and machine gun crews waited behind sandbags and stone walls. The Germans had learned to exploit every rock, every ridge, every shadow in these mountains. They were disciplined, well-equipped, and ruthless. As the Italian unit approached the base of the ridge, the first test came. A lone German scout moved along the trail ahead. Marco raised his rifle and fired, the shot echoing like thunder. The scout fell, and immediately, alarms were raised. Searchlights cut through the mist, and the first bursts of machine gun fire shattered the stillness. Bullets whistled past, ricocheting off stone and trees, as the Italians dove for cover behind rocks and boulders. Captain Ricci barked orders, splitting the unit into two groups, one to suppress the German fire, the other to flank along a hidden trail identified by partisans. The forest erupted in chaos, gunfire, shouting, and the screams of the wounded filled the night. Italian soldiers moved with precision, despite the hail of bullets and the harsh terrain. Each step was a battle, each breath a reminder of mortality. Marco sprinted along a narrow ledge, heart pounding, as bullets tore through the air around him. One round struck stone inches from his foot, sending shards flying into the snow. Beside him, Lieutenant Ricci called coordinates for a small mortar team, firing blindly into the German positions on the ridge. Explosions shook the mountain, sending plumes of smoke and rock flying, momentarily blinding the enemy and giving the Italians a small advantage. Hours passed in a blur of combat. The first light of dawn revealed the devastation. The forest was scarred, broken trees splintered by gunfire and shrapnel, the snow stained with blood and mud. Fires from destroyed outposts flickered across the ridges, casting twisted shadows that seemed to dance with the chaos. Several soldiers were wounded, their cries muffled by the wind, yet morale remained strong. Captain Ricci gathered his men in a narrow ravine for a brief respite. He tended to the wounded, giving orders in a calm, measured voice that belied the tension surrounding them. Marco checked his rifle, cleaning the dust and snow from the barrel, eyes scanning the ridge for enemy movement. They knew the Germans would counterattack. Nightfall would bring another storm of bullets, and the fight for Monte Forno had only just begun. The mountains themselves seemed to pulse with anticipation. Every ridge and shadow could hide a German sniper. The narrow passes funneled movement, making every advance a calculated risk. Yet the Italian soldiers pressed on, driven by a mix of duty, revenge, and unyielding courage. Captain Ricci's unit was small, but they carried the determination of a larger army, and in the Apennines, sometimes determination could outweigh firepower. As night fell, the wind picked up, sending icy gusts through the ravine. Snow began to drift again, covering tracks and hiding movement. Each man checked his ammunition and weapons, listening to the distant crack of German artillery and the faint echoes of movement on the ridge above. They knew that survival would require more than courage. It would require cunning, timing, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for the mission. And so, in the shadow of Monte Forno, amidst the jagged cliffs and frozen forest, the Italians prepared. Tomorrow would bring blood, fire, and heroism. Tomorrow would test their resolve. And tomorrow, the clash between Italy and Germany would escalate into a battle neither side could afford to lose. The first clash. Dawn broke over the Apennine Mountains, casting pale light on the scarred slopes. The night had been long and unforgiving. Italian soldiers huddled in a narrow ravine, tending to wounds and preparing for the inevitable counterattack. Captain Alessandro Ricci scanned the ridges above, binoculars pressed to his eyes, noting the shifting shadows of German patrols. The enemy had regrouped, their presence undeniable. Smoke rose from destroyed outposts, and the sharp tang of gunpowder still lingered in the air. The Italian unit, though small, was resolute. They had claimed a precarious foothold on Monte Forno, but the Germans were determined to reclaim it. Lieutenant Ricci called for a quiet briefing, gathering his men in the lee of the rocks. "We hold this ridge at all costs," he said, voice low but firm. "Every position we hold denies the enemy supplies and slows their advance. They will come, and we will be ready." Marco, the young partisan, checked his rifle once more. His eyes were weary but alert, scanning every slope, every shadow. The mountains seemed alive, the wind carrying distant cries, the occasional crack of rifle fire echoing across the valley below. Each man felt the tension settle into his bones. In the Apennines, mistakes were fatal. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. German artillery opened fire on the ridge, the shells tearing through snow and rock. Explosions sent plumes of debris into the air, and the ground shook beneath the Italians' feet. Men shouted over the roar, diving for cover behind jagged rocks and boulders. The first volleys tore through the forest, striking frozen trees and the narrow trail that led to the ridge. Several soldiers fell, their cries lost in the deafening blast. Captain Ricci yelled orders, directing his small mortars to fire into the German positions on the slopes. Smoke and flame rose from the ridge, momentarily blinding the defenders and allowing Italian soldiers to advance. Marco sprinted across a narrow ledge, his boots slipping on ice and snow, as he fired into exposed enemy positions. Each step was calculated, each breath a gamble. Bullets whistled past him, some striking stone just inches from his boots. The Germans responded swiftly. Machine guns raked the Italian positions, cutting down anything in their path. Snipers perched on higher ridges picked off soldiers moving between cover. Artillery rounds continued to fall, sending rocks and snow tumbling down the slopes. The mountain itself seemed to fight alongside the enemy, each ridge, cliff, and narrow path a deadly trap. Despite the chaos, the Italians pressed on. Partisans led flanking maneuvers through hidden trails, using their knowledge of the terrain to strike at German positions from unexpected angles. Marco and a small team crept along a steep ridge, eliminating sentries and opening a path for their comrades. The firefight was relentless, the cries of men, the rattle of machine guns, the thud of mortars, all blending into a nightmarish symphony of war. Captain Ricci observed the battlefield from behind a boulder. He calculated movements, redirected fire, and encouraged his men. "Hold your ground! Push forward! Don't give them an inch!" he shouted, the snow and smoke carrying his voice across the ridge. The soldiers obeyed, firing, crawling, and charging in waves, each engagement a brutal test of courage and endurance. Hours stretched into an eternity. The Germans counterattacked repeatedly, their disciplined formations attempting to retake lost positions. Mortar shells exploded among the Italians, smoke and debris filling the air. Marco saw his closest friend struck down by a sniper, blood soaking into the snow. The young partisan froze for a heartbeat, shock and grief threatening to paralyze him, but the memory of his family's death hardened his resolve. He fired relentlessly, advancing under cover, refusing to yield. Night approached, but the fighting showed no signs of slowing. Both sides were exhausted, but the battle for Monte Forno raged on. Flames from burning outposts illuminated the ridge, casting long, twisted shadows over men frozen in action. The Apennines were a deadly theater, every boulder, tree, and ridge a potential death trap. Yet the Italians held. By late evening, the ridge had been secured, but at a terrible cost. Half of Ricci's unit was wounded or killed. Bodies lay strewn across the snow, frozen expressions etched on their faces. Marco stared at the horizon, watching German reinforcements moving along the distant slopes. The battle was far from over. Tomorrow would bring more fire, more blood, and the ultimate test of courage. Captain Ricci gathered the survivors in a narrow trench, checking ammunition and tending to the injured. "We survived today," he said, his voice steady despite exhaustion. "But we must be ready. The Germans will come again, and this ridge will demand everything we have." The men nodded, some silently mourning fallen comrades, others staring into the night, ready to face whatever came next. The mountains themselves seemed to breathe, the wind carrying echoes of artillery and gunfire, reminding the soldiers that Monte Forno was a prize hard won, a foothold temporary and fragile. Survival would require more than courage, it would require cunning, endurance, and the unbreakable will to fight on, against an enemy just as determined, and the harsh, unforgiving mountain itself. The Apennines were shrouded in smoke and shadows as dawn broke over Monte Forno. Captain Alessandro Ricci's unit had held the ridge through the night, but exhaustion was written into every soldier's face. Fingers were numbed from the cold, rifles coated in frost, and the constant roar of artillery had left ears ringing. Yet retreat was not an option. The Germans were regrouping, and their counterattack would be relentless. Lieutenant Ricci surveyed the battlefield. Across the jagged slopes, German forces assembled with grim efficiency. Reinforcements were arriving from the valley below, infantry moving in tight formations, supported by mortars and machine guns. The ridge that the Italians had fought so hard to secure was now the target of an impending storm. Every defensive position had to be manned, every angle covered. "Positions! Hold the line!" Ricci shouted, his voice cutting through the cold wind. Marco and his fellow partisans scrambled into exposed trenches, their rifles ready, eyes scanning for enemy movement. The snow, now deeper and heavier, slowed both sides, but it also provided cover for silent flanking maneuvers. The Germans knew the terrain but had underestimated the determination of the Italians and their knowledge of hidden trails. The first wave of German troops climbed the slopes, moving with mechanical precision. Mortar rounds exploded among the Italian positions, hurling snow and rock into the air. Marco fired from behind a boulder, picking off advancing soldiers with deadly accuracy. Bullets tore through the frozen trees, echoing across the mountains, while machine guns rattled, shredding the air with continuous bursts. The sound of battle was deafening, cries of pain, the whistle of bullets, the roar of artillery, and the metallic clash of hand-to-hand combat. Italian soldiers responded with every ounce of training and courage they possessed. Mortars fired blindly into the German lines, creating chaos and confusion. Partisan fighters led daring flanking attacks, striking German positions from unexpected angles. Marco and a small team crawled through snowdrifts, approaching a machine gun nest that had pinned down half the ridge. With grenades in hand, they charged, tossing explosives that tore through sandbags and concrete, leaving stunned enemy soldiers reeling. The fighting became brutal and personal. Close-quarters combat erupted on the ridge. Soldiers grappled in the snow, rifles and bayonets clashing, fists striking faces, and desperate men fighting for every inch. Captain Ricci engaged a German officer who had advanced too close, parrying with the butt of his rifle before knocking him into the snow. Around him, men risked their lives to pull comrades from the line of fire, each second a fight against death. Hours passed like minutes. The Germans mounted wave after wave, their discipline evident in the precision of their attacks, but the Italians held, refusing to yield. Each hillock, each boulder, each ruined outpost became a battleground. Marco found himself separated from his squad, firing from a narrow ledge as enemy soldiers surged below him. He moved with instinct and experience, reloading rapidly, ducking under bursts of machine gun fire, and advancing when the enemy hesitated. As night fell once again, the battle reached a critical point. German artillery rained down with terrifying accuracy, flattening positions and sending snow, earth, and rock flying. Mortars exploded mere feet from the Italian lines, hurling soldiers to the ground. Smoke and fire engulfed parts of the ridge, turning the battlefield into a chaotic inferno. But the Italians held fast, their determination strengthened by the thought of comrades fallen, by the desire to reclaim their homeland, and by the unyielding spirit of survival. Captain Ricci's unit was battered, but their resilience had turned the tide. The Germans, facing unexpected resistance and mounting casualties, were forced to pull back temporarily. Marco, bloodied and exhausted, looked over the ridge at the enemy withdrawing into the shadows. Around him lay the cost of the battle, men he had trained and fought alongside, now still in the snow, frozen expressions etched on their faces. Despite the temporary reprieve, the Italian soldiers knew the fight was far from over. The ridge was theirs for now, but the Germans would return, stronger and more determined. Every man on Monte Forno understood that survival required vigilance, courage, and unity. They had held the line against overwhelming odds, but tomorrow would bring another test, another wave of bullets, fire, and steel that would demand everything they had. The Apennine wind howled across the ridge, carrying with it the echoes of battle. Flames flickered among the outposts, illuminating frozen faces and fallen comrades. Captain Ricci gathered his men, tending to the wounded and redistributing ammunition. "We survived today," he said, voice steady yet heavy with exhaustion. "But remember, Monte Forno is not won yet. Tomorrow, we fight again or we fall." The soldiers tightened their grips on rifles, adjusted their helmets, and scanned the darkness. Every shadow could conceal an enemy, every sound a warning. Yet in that moment, amid the devastation and death, there was a shared understanding. Courage and sacrifice were the only currency on this frozen battlefield, and the Italian soldiers were determined to pay the price. Dawn broke over Monte Forno, pale and cold, revealing the full scale of the devastation. The ridge, once a strategic vantage, was now a scarred battlefield. Snow, stained with blood, crunched underfoot as the survivors of Captain Ricci's unit moved cautiously among the remnants of their defensive positions. The howling wind carried distant echoes, the retreating footsteps of German forces, the moans of the wounded, and the haunting silence of those who had fallen. Captain Alessandro Ricci surveyed the battlefield with a heavy heart. Half his unit had been killed or gravely wounded during the desperate counterattacks of the previous night. Partisans and soldiers alike lay scattered across the snow, their faces frozen in expressions of fear, determination, and defiance. Ricci's hands shook slightly as he counted the survivors. Marco, bloodied and exhausted, emerged from behind a boulder, clutching his rifle and scanning the slopes for any remaining threats. "Is anyone else alive down there?" Ricci called, his voice carrying across the ridge. Only silence answered. The cost of holding Monte Forno was starkly visible. Supplies were nearly depleted, ammunition was low, and the bitter wind gnawed at every exposed inch of flesh. Yet the Italians had survived, holding their position against a determined enemy. It was a hollow victory, tempered by the weight of loss. The wounded were tended first. Marco helped drag a comrade into a shallow trench, using scraps of cloth and snow to stop the bleeding. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Ricci moved methodically, checking the rifles, redistributing ammunition, and assigning men to guard key positions. Every decision was a matter of life and death. The Germans would regroup, and Monte Forno would not remain uncontested for long. Despite exhaustion, Ricci gathered the men to discuss their next move. "We have survived this night, but survival alone is not victory," he said, his eyes scanning the distant slopes. We hold this ridge not just for ourselves, but for every village the Germans occupy, for every family that suffers under their rule. We will stand, and we will fight again if we must." The men nodded silently, some swallowing the lump in their throats as grief threatened to overwhelm them. They had endured terror, loss, and chaos, yet their resolve remained. As the sun rose higher, the full scene of the battle was revealed. Craters pockmarked the snow, burned-out vehicles lay twisted and blackened, and shattered trees jutted into the pale sky like skeletal fingers. German positions had been damaged but not destroyed, and distant patrols could be seen regrouping along lower ridges. Marco looked across the battlefield, the memory of friends lost and the intensity of combat still burning in his mind. Yet there was a strange sense of pride. They had survived against overwhelming odds. In the hours that followed, the survivors fortified their positions. Trenches were deepened, obstacles set along the narrow trails, and lookout posts positioned to anticipate the next German advance. Captain Ricci moved from man to man, offering words of encouragement and quietly acknowledging the bravery of each soldier. He knew that tomorrow might bring another wave of attacks, but for now, the ridge was theirs. As night fell once again, the Apennines were silent, save for the wind rustling through the trees. The men huddled in their trenches, sharing what little warmth and food remained. Marco stared into the darkness, thinking of his fallen comrades, of the family he had lost, and of the courage that had carried him through the night. He realized that survival was more than a matter of skill or luck. It was a testament to human endurance and the bonds forged in the crucible of battle. Captain Ricci lit a small lantern, its flickering light casting shadows on the snow-streaked faces of the survivors. "We fight not because we desire glory, but because we must," he said softly. "We fight for each other, for Italy, and for every life touched by this war." The men nodded, understanding the gravity of their actions. Each bullet fired, each ridge held, each life sacrificed was part of a story larger than themselves, a story of courage, resilience, and defiance in the face of an unrelenting enemy. The first stars appeared above the Apennines, glimmering coldly against the dark sky. The ridge was quiet now, but the memory of battle would linger in the minds of those who survived. Marco, tired beyond measure, rested his rifle against his shoulder and closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of what had transpired. He understood that this fight, like so many in the mountains of Italy and across the world, was part of a larger struggle, one that demanded sacrifice, endurance, and unbroken courage. Monte Forno had been held for now. The Italians had faced the might of the German army, endured loss and terror, and survived. But the war was far from over. Each man knew that tomorrow could bring fire, steel, and blood once more. Yet amid the horror they carried hope, the hope that their courage would inspire others, that their sacrifices would not be in vain, and that even in the darkness of war, the human spirit could endure. The mountains stood silent once more, witnessing the aftermath of a clash that would be remembered in whispers, letters, and stories. Captain Ricci and his men had survived, and in doing so, had etched their courage into the snow and stone of Monte Forno, a testament to the resilience of those who dared to fight against overwhelming odds. Weeks had passed since the brutal struggle for Monte Forno. The ridge, once scarred with fire, smoke, and blood, now lay quiet under a thin blanket of early winter snow. Captain Alessandro Ricci and his remaining men had rotated to a nearby village to recover and regroup. Yet the memory of the battle lingered in every shadow, every wind gust, and every creak of the mountainside. Survival had come at a high cost, friends lost, comrades wounded, and the scars of war etched deeply into the hearts of all who remained. Ricci walked through the village, observing the civilians who had endured occupation, bombings, and fear. Children stared from behind windows, women carried water in buckets over frozen paths, and men moved cautiously through the ruins of buildings half destroyed by artillery. The war had touched every life, every family, leaving no one untouched. Yet despite the devastation, there was resilience. Just as the soldiers had fought for Monte Forno, the civilians had fought daily to survive, to maintain some semblance of normalcy amid chaos. Marco, now more seasoned and hardened by the horrors of combat, stood on a hill overlooking the ridge. He remembered the screams, the smoke, the relentless hail of bullets, and the faces of the fallen. Yet he also remembered courage, the bravery of his comrades, the selflessness of Captain Ricci, and the moments when ordinary men became heroes. Each memory was a bitter mix of grief and pride, a reminder that in war, survival itself was a victory. The ridge of Monte Forno had been held, but it had not been conquered without sacrifice. The Germans had retreated, regrouping to stronger positions further down the valley, preparing for future operations. The battle had delayed them, disrupted supply lines, and sent a powerful message: Italian forces, though smaller and less equipped, could fight with ingenuity, determination, and an unbreakable will. Stories of Marco and Ricci's actions spread among other units and partisans, inspiring hope and courage across the region. Captain Ricci convened his surviving officers to plan the next phase of operations. Despite exhaustion, they knew that the ridge was only one small part of a larger war. The German army remained formidable, and every engagement risked lives. Yet they also understood the importance of morale. Each act of defiance, each foothold retained, strengthened the resolve of Italian troops and partisans alike. As night fell over the Apennines, the wind whispered through the ridges, carrying echoes of the battle. The ghosts of the fallen seemed to linger, but so too did their courage. Marco and his comrades lit small fires in hidden trenches, sharing stories of the fight, honoring those who had fallen, and remembering the sacrifices made in the name of freedom and country. These moments of quiet reflection were as vital as any combat maneuver, sustaining the soldiers' spirits and reminding them why they fought. Over time, Monte Forno became a symbol. It was no longer just a ridge in the Apennines. It represented the courage of those who dared to resist a powerful enemy, the sacrifices of ordinary men who became heroes, and the human capacity to endure unimaginable hardship. Letters were written to families, reports sent to headquarters, and whispers of bravery traveled across villages and valleys. The battle had ended, but its echoes would remain, shaping memories, history, and the hearts of those who lived through it. Marco, standing once more on the ridge, gazed at the horizon. The mountains stretched endlessly, silent witnesses to the suffering, heroism, and resilience that had unfolded. He understood that war would continue, that more battles lay ahead, but he also knew that courage and sacrifice had power beyond the battlefield. They were legacies, etched into snow and stone, into hearts and minds, and into the story of a nation struggling to survive amid the horrors of World War II. Captain Ricci placed a hand on Marco's shoulder. "We did what we had to do," he said quietly. "We held the ridge. We saved lives. And we remembered those who could not stand with us today." Marco nodded, feeling the weight of loss and the pride of survival. Together, they turned toward the village below, ready to continue the fight, carrying the lessons of Monte Forno with them, that even in the darkest hours, courage, sacrifice, and the human spirit could endure. As night enveloped the Apennines, the stars twinkled coldly above, indifferent to the battles below. Yet in the hearts of the survivors, a fire burned, a memory of bravery, a testament to resilience, and a promise that the sacrifices of Monte Forno would not be forgotten. The clash between Italy and Germany had left scars on the land and on men, but it had also forged heroes, stories, and a legacy that would echo far beyond the mountains.